brand. The first movie, if you actually looked on the bottom of an actual Buzz Lightyear toy, it said property of Buena Vista, which was the Disney parent company. And by the second movie, if you looked at the bottom of it, it said property of Pixar. And that was really, that's why Pixar took over Disney right there. And it's all about who owns the character.
Is it true that the Pixar guys put themselves into their films, their personality? And
Yeah, I mean, again, animation's really nifty because you can really talk about everything in 15 different ways. You can do it and do it again and do it again. But what actually happened in Pixar is there were two lead animators who have gone on to be animation directors, and one really took over Buzz and one really took over Woody. And when you dealt with them, it was as if you were talking to the actor, but their personalities definitely came in there. And Buzz Lightyear always, in my mind, looked a lot like John Lasseter. So.
yeah, okay, identical, yeah.
Without the sexual harassment.
But isn't that a little bit of the model that Disney used for his closest set of animators, that were actually each of them were becoming the character? And so
absolutely. And another really cool thing about animation, it's really playful. And when you work in animation, the tradition is that a bunch of people, unfortunately it's mostly men, but traditionally, hopefully that's changing, would be in a room and they would act out moments and they would draw and create sculptures and do all this. It's very, from the ground up creation. So you definitely get to put your imprimatur, and there's a lot of inside jokes, which even to this day probably nobody but the people who put it into the film really laugh at.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you go to Emeryville, to where Pixar is, or the individual offices of the animators, they're like worlds. And depending on the film, they surround themselves with stuff that is kind of inscrutable to any foreign visitor, but it's obviously talking to them about what they are creating in there. And how much do you think technology, such as the one we saw this in its infancy, has made animation accessible to young wannabe filmmakers, like some of them we might have here?
You guys want to tell stories with movies or draw? Do you guys like to draw? Yeah. Here's the thing. So in the early 90s, all the technology was proprietary, and everybody that was trying to do what Pixar did was having to write their own technology. And by the late 90s, there was one bit of software called Maya, which happens to be my daughter's name. No coincidence, or just coincidence, I should say. But Maya became the worldwide software for computer animation, and that has allowed all the computers around the world to talk to each other, which has kind of made the world flat for animation, which is one of the main reasons why there's so much animation now, is because you can have people working all around the world at the same time on one project.
Does anyone have any question?
I wrote all those. Yeah. You know what? I am really bad at remembering these things. Joel is much better at remembering these things. But Mr. Potato Head we got to play with from the first draft. A lot of the toys were placeholder toys, but chances are we were having. Doesn't that sound like Joel? Right? And so like. Yeah, exactly. And so that's the one thing that I can tell you with 100% certainty is that we wrote Into Infinity and Beyond, and I actually found like an old notepad that had all these slogans or little things scribbled on, and then that's the one that was circled, and it was like, oh, that was the one we were going to do.
Which then became the title for Pixar's big book, to Infinity.
Yeah.
They took it,
which
as
is kind of ironic in its
yeah.
conceit. I mean, it's. Absolutely. Steamboat Willie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that again, it lends itself to it because you can actually see and feel the whole world from a character or from an item that you wouldn't naturally do that. But yeah, my favorite thing are all the little squishy toys where the claw is God. Like that's my favorite scene in the whole movie. So like that for that very reason, that from their point of view, the claw is God. And so yeah, it's hey, I'm watching it and I'm smiling a lot at just how much ended up in the film. These kind of ideas that almost become throwaway ideas, but they're not, because they become the fabric that the whole world can exist in. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah. She has a question.
In the case, in the case of Toy Story, we were brought on. Like I said, we had, when Joel and I met, I could use these terms like we knew what we were doing, but we did this analysis of the entertainment industry, and we kind of said, how do you succeed? How do you survive as screenwriters? And we made the choice very early on to try and write buddy stories. That kind of going back to the beginning of Hollywood and studios, there were always buddy stories, and so our first attempt became this movie, Money Talks, which I just mentioned. Our second one became a script that we never were able to sell called The Wooden Policeman, a live-action R-rated buddy story, but it had a character, Buzz and Woody, in it, and both of those scripts were what somebody at Disney and then somebody at Pixar read and got us the opportunity. So once we were on board, we would have these meetings around a conference table with the Pixar guys, the Disney executives, and us. And in many cases, and without being too self-serving about it, we had to educate them about buddy stuff, because we had been spending all those years like picking it apart. And so you'd have these things of, okay, what is the formula of buddy stories? And if you actually think about rom-coms are buddy stories also. You think about it, there's this algorithm of trust and ability that runs through a bit of storytelling. Who has the trust and who has the ability? And generally speaking, it's characters that are thrust together and are forced to figure out how to succeed together that don't want to. So it's simplistic, but it's also freeing. It's like it allows you to play jazz and stuff. And so we'd sit with the Pixar folks and we'd sit with the Disney folks. We would talk about story. They would tell us about what their technology could and couldn't do. They couldn't do people very well, so there were other human characters in the first drafts, and those got erased because they didn't want to spend more time on people than they had to. And then Joel and I would go off and write, and it's kind of the cliche of how screenplays are birthed. Yeah, we would just write, and it's so long ago, but it's not. But I can remember like the script spitting out of the printer where all the pages were attached. It had the little ringlets on the side. I mean, it was like, and it spits out, and you look at it and you have to like carefully rip everything apart and do the whole thing. But we wrote the first 7 drafts, and so.
And this was a process of a few years, right?
Yeah, well, we worked. We were a little less than a year, and then one of the things that happens, which you can look at either way, is that as your work gets more accepted in any project, you become less important as a human being, and so there's this weird paradox where you've done a good job when they want to replace you, because that means that other egos are starting to want to take hold of something. But no, I'm saying that as not a bad thing. That's just, so we were replaced by Joss Whedon, who's gone on to a wonderful career as a writer-director. He came on and did his work, and then the Pixar guys, and there were 4 guys that are on the script that actually didn't do technical writing, although they did so much storytelling. They continued and birthed it, and it just became this long collective process. There's a phrase in Hollywood, probably other industries, but that a success has 1,000 parents, and an orphan, and a failure is an orphan. And so this was a success. So there's a lot of people whose hands are on it, but we were the, well, like when you write screenplays, first draft screenplays, at least for me, you're creating the themes, you're creating the spine, it's architecture, you're creating the structure that a story can exist in, and if you do it well enough, or to somebody's satisfaction, it's the architecture that allows it to live. And then everything else, again, who says what line, I couldn't possibly tell you at this point, but I know that those lines can't exist if the scenes aren't set up right, and if the characters aren't defined right, and all of the, that's what I think screenwriting really is. And in a way, if you do that really well, you are disposable as a person because you've already done you've given a structure.
And it's interesting because going back to what you were saying yesterday over the phone, when you said it's so character-based, because you believe these characters and they don't do much. This word is very, because I think going back to what April was saying before about surrealism in animation, the power of it, part of the power is that it makes you feel, it heightens your perception of life, because you create these words that are so small that you feel so much about a plate moving, a window open, right. You know, you sort of get fall in love with life again through this very stylized version of it, and I think it's kind of miraculous.
Yeah, and I think there's a paradox that I certainly feel, when you look at animation that really feels almost photoreal, Polar Express being an attempt at that, and Beowulf, the characters somehow seem less alive to me, and I don't even know why, but they sort of do, and whereas in something where you're so obviously not living, it's kind of like listening to baseball on the radio or something. No, but that's...
The uncanny value?
Mm.
Ballet.
Yeah. Mm. It was cold. It was very cold.
So it was some of the motion capture animation that Zemeckis did has been accused of being repulsive as opposed to embracing, yeah.
No, exactly, and so I mean, I could just say for me, there are two. Billy Wilder is somebody I really have studied and revere, and he has a 10 Commandments of screenwriting that you can find online in a second. And one of them, and just to paraphrase it, is that allow the audience to do some work. If you do some work, you got them. And so that I think is really important, but that requires having a strong logic base. So it's the things you don't have to say. And then the other one, and this goes way back, but Chaplin or Buster Keaton, I still learn when I watch those films. But Chaplin was once asked, how do you do the banana trick? And do you show the banana, then you show the person, and then show the banana, you show the person, you show the person step on the banana and fall, or do you show the person and then you show the banana? And he said, no, what you do is you show the person, you show the banana, and then you show the person step over the banana and fall into a manhole cover. And it's, and I think that's it. It's like logic. Yeah. Like comedy is there's the power of three in comedy. The first two set up the logic, and the third one blows it up. That's the fun. That's the addiction, in my opinion.
I think Emma wanted to ask something.
Mm-hmm. I think the flying motif is, so I didn't have kids when I was working on this, and I had no idea that there's like an operational stage of development Buzz Lightyear fits into. And when my son and daughter actually hit a certain age, around 4, they both had this flying fantasy. And I think the way we use that in Falling with Style and just everything, that to me is the one where, in the best movies and the movies I love the most, it feels like there's no wasted information. And I feel like this one definitely accomplishes that, yeah.
Susan.
Yeah. Oh, what is it? Who has witches? Polar Express doesn't have witches, you're right. It also didn't have an audience. Right, and guess what? The conductor in Polar Express, if I remember correctly, was Tom Hanks, right? So he populated both films. That's in 2 days. Well, you know what's so funny? So the first draft, it's actually that
Sorry,
is
Susan,
why
the decision
why
to make the family.
Andy's. All right, all right. So you just actually touched the nerve because the first drafts that Joel and I wrote, Andy came from a very stable 2-parent home, and Sid came from a single-parent home, and we thought that would somehow explain their predilections. And actually, in the very first draft, Buzz Lightyear was a present from Andy's father, who had already moved forward to start a job. So even though we weren't going to have him physically in the film, he was in the storytelling, and in a way, Buzz was going to be a surrogate father figure. We lost that fight, and it was, who knows why? The Pixar guys were just like less human characters. So even Sid, you hear of a mom, but you don't really see the mom. You only see the dad's like in the lazy chair. But no, I always, that, for me, that bothers me still, because not that it has to be that way, but it's just as, to me, Andy's such a well-adjusted kid. I love Sid, by the way. Like, I personally, I personally think if you actually look at these characters as if they were human, the idea that toys talk to him at a certain point would have sent him into therapies and medications and adults not believing him. And Sid, to me, if this actually played out like Boyhood or one of those films, would have a far more interesting adulthood from having that experience. Or he'd be a serial killer. I don't know. Oh, you're right. You're right. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that, like, in the way that you want to have logic on everything and sell the logic, it just made sense in that first draft. But it's amazing, how you can tell a story with the information you don't give. And in here, this was purely a function of what the toys characters needed. So they didn't need another adult human.
I think just one more thing before we go. You just finished directing your first animated short.
Well, I did. It's pretty heavy-winded. So I produced a documentary that's on Netflix now called I Am Jane Doe. That is the story of 2 survivors of underage sex trafficking and their families trying to shut down the website in the United States that they were advertised on. And then as an adjunct to that, we took some money, and I wrote and then ended up co-writing with an organization up in Boston that works with survivors. So I work with 12 kids, on a script of something that'll be an educational, kind of a PSA type animation short, about 9 minutes long. I was able to bring in an animation company, and this goes back to how animation has technology that the whole world can communicate, out of Chile, named Punk Robot. And they won an Academy Award a couple years ago for Best Short, and they did the animation, so I co-directed, co-wrote, co-produced it, and we're just rolling it out now, and it's going to be something that really hopefully will end up in the YMCA's and schools and across the country, just to give kids some tools and education.
And where can we see it?
You come to my house. Yeah, no, you know what? It's not available yet to the public. We actually, I don't know, dive into a little politics here. Betsy DeVos has been pretty good about this film, and that really makes me feel weird. So, exactly. Probably because she knows there's a buck to be made.
Okay, well, thank you, Alec. Thank you again for being
thanks
here.
you all for coming out.